Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to wherever you are joining us for the July edition of the ASBxSEACEN webinars on macrofinance and emerging markets. I am joined today by Professor Hans Genberg from the ASB, who will be the co-moderator for the session today. I'm extremely pleased to be introducing our guest today, who really needs no introduction. And it's Professor Xiangjin Wei from the Graduate School of Business at Columbia University. And he's going to talk to us today about his latest paper, International Equity and Debt Flows, Composition, Crisis, and Controls, which, so in one paper, Professor Wei talks about all the topics that are of interest to our region. So I'm very much looking forward to his presentation, and I think the audience is as well, because we have 170 people signed up for this. Before I turn you over to Xiangjin, just wanted to give you a brief introduction for the one or two of you who may not have come across Xiangjin before. So Professor Wei is the N.T. Wang Professor of Chinese Business and Economy and Professor of Finance and Economics at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business and the School of International Public Affairs. He is one of the world's foremost scholars on international finance and trade and the Chinese economy. And many of us will remember him from his time as a chief economist at the Asian Development Bank in 2014 and 2016. Before joining the Columbia University, he was assistant director and chief of the trade and investment division at the IMF. Xiangjin holds a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. So with that, Xiangjin, over to you. We'll have to make the changes. We have to, okay.
Great, so I clicked show screen, and then how do I go to my slides from here?
Okay, your slides are showing below. If you click on the PowerPoint icon.
Oh, actually, if I show on the screen, you can see it. Like, can you see the slides right now? You can.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Perfect. Well, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. This is the greeting of the day, greeting of the era. Yes. It's my pleasure to join you from New York. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to share my research with you. I had spent 2 very happy years of my life in Southeast Asia, so I'm wearing one of my clothes collection from the time today. So the title of my research paper is International Equity and Debt Flows, Composition, Crisis, and Controls. This is a joint work with Chang Ma of Fudan University in Shanghai. It's easy to motivate the topic that motivated this project. Capital flows are important to emerging markets, yet capital flows are very volatile. Sometimes it can contribute to financial crisis, debt crisis, banking crisis, currency crisis as well, and can contribute to volatility in consumption. So here's a picture that you probably have seen versions of it many times. Dramatic inflow of capital into emerging markets and very high volatilities. This is a picture taken from Reinhardt and Rogoff. The existing literature, of course, there's a very large literature about capital flows. The existing literature about capital flows in emerging markets emphasizes the existence of pecuniary externalities. That is, when agents, households, or firms borrow from international capital market, the agent may not necessarily take into account the effect of his action or its action on the aggregate economy-wide borrowing abilities. In particular, if a country faces an economy-wide constraint to borrow, that constraint, whenever that constraint is triggered, maybe debt cannot be renewed and the country can run into crisis. But this kind of socially less desirable consequences are not something that individual agents take into account when they borrow. So this particular idea has been modeled by a very long list of papers in the literature that I put it out here, including several papers published in top journals, Mendoza in AER, Bianchi in AER, and Zhang and Kolinek in AER, and so on. So a long list of prominent papers by prominent authors, explaining this idea. Okay, so I take it as given that this is now a well accepted. In fact, it's the leading way to think about that this possibility that international capital flows embeds externalities, and therefore, if it might require policy intervention in the form of a tax on debt flows. A recent paper by Schmidt, Grohe, and Uribe suggests that you can have different way to introduce externalities, and their way to introduce externalities is through demand channels. And you can also have demand externalities that will also lead to over borrowing. So every individual, by not taking into account effect of his action on the likelihood that aggregate demand could be too low, there's a market failure there, and therefore they will also call for tax on debt. In both cases, therefore, essentially the totality of the literature on this topic, the focus is on debt flows. In fact, that's the way people model capital flows into emerging markets. People envision that as essentially fixed income type of flows. Now, of course, we know in actual data, every central banker knows that varieties of capital flows are a bit richer than that. We can also have equity type of flows. Equity type flows potentially are quite different from debt flows. In particular, by its very nature, equity flows have a better risk sharing feature. That is, if a country is hit by a negative productivity shock or falling interest rate shock, those kind of shocks are the things that will cause, in the existing model that features only debt flow, essentially a crisis. That collateral constraint becomes more binding and you run into a crisis. But that type of crisis will not happen for equity flows, because equity flows, by its very nature, international investors automatically share risk share real side risk with the capital recipient countries. In fact, imagine a world in which emerging markets only get equity financing from international investors. In their world, all the risks potentially can be offloaded to international investors if international investors are risk neutral, which is a typical assumption made in the literature. But in general, even if they are not risk neutral, there's a very high degree of sharing of a real side risk. And the kind of concern that exists in literature about capital flows in emerging markets, in fact, will go away. In fact, in an alternative world in which capital flow takes the form of equity financing. Now, of course, the real world capital flows involves a mixture of debt flows and equity flows, and therefore we need to understand, why we see this mixture and what determines this mixture and what differences does it make for different countries with different kind of mixes. So here's a pair of graphs taken from one of my early papers with Hui Tong in Review of Financial Studies. That plots at the time of our writing, we group capital flows into direct investment, portfolio investment, and foreign loans. These three types, and the main takeaway from the picture on the left is that foreign loans or fixed income type of flows is more volatile, are more volatile than equity type of financing. So composition matters in terms of overall volatilities. And the graph on the right plots the extent to which for the episode of a global financial crisis, the extent to which we see big reversal of capital flows subsequent to the global financial crisis, relative to the country's pre-crisis composition of capital flows. Let me see one more time. The graph on the right essentially plots out individual countries' experience with capital flows around the global financial crisis time. On the horizontal axis, we plot the pre-crisis share of a country's FDI inflow in total external liabilities. So you can think of this as a description about structure of capital flows before crisis. On the vertical axis, it shows the amount of net capital outflow from the country after global financial crisis. So what this shows, and the number, the lower the number, the greater the outflow. The positive slope means that those countries whose pre-crisis share of FDI is relatively high tends to experience a smaller capital outflows. In contrast, countries that rely more on debt flows tend to experience much greater outflow of capitals. And we have subsequent papers that look at firm level data that also confirms the idea that the pre-crisis composition of capital flows matters at the firm level, how they suffer from the global financial crisis. These are emerging markets for which global financial crisis essentially is a foreign crisis in North America and Europe. So the takeaway from our 2010 paper and subsequent papers is that composition of capital flows matters. At the time, we were not classifying capital flows the way today's paper will do. So today I'm going to adopt somewhat different classifications, but still the main point is that composition matters. That the capital flow composition in particular matters for a country's experience during crisis. Here's another picture that we do for this project. Maybe just look at the graph on the right. So it's a neater graph to look. That summarizes, that plots a country's composition of capital flows. These are equity as a share of external liability. Equity defined as FDI, inward FDI plus inward equity portfolio divided by total capital inflow. That's on the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is a measure of the quality of public institutions. So control on corruption, independence of a judicial system, and so on, or control on the risk of expropriation. We see a positive association between these two variables over the period of 1996 to 2015. That is, composition of capital flows is not random. In the data, there seems to be a strong positive association between how good a country's institution is in terms of ability to control corruption, to control expropriation risk, and how much it can attract equity capital inflows. Okay, so part of the project is trying to understand this picture and trying to explore implications of this picture. Okay, so I'm going to show you some regression results documenting three basic patterns in the data that we think are very relevant, very important to note. The first, oops, now the slides disappear on my screen. So how do I get it back? How do I get back my slides? I think I clicked something I should not have clicked.
We can see a slide called data path.
I only see
you
myself
and,
right now. I see a picture.
and we also see a slide called data patterns.
Right. So how do I see the slide on my screen? Maybe file. It's the danger of using a software that I'm not familiar with. Audience view, no. Apologize.
One option is clicking on escape button on top left.
Okay.
That minimizes your screen, hopefully, and then.
No, that doesn't seem to do it.
No. Ash, would you be able to help us?
Yeah, sure. It's probably clicked accidentally clicked outside. If you click back again on the PowerPoint, then we can resume the.
I don't see PowerPoint on my slides.
Okay, so give me a second. I'll open it up on my side and I'll project it from my end.
My apologies, but let me talk through. So the three data patterns are, the first one is the one I just show you, that from an emerging market point of view, a given country's share of inward equity financing in total external liability seems to be positively associated with the strength of a local institutional quality. That's number one. And number two, the probability of a financial crisis seems to be negatively associated with the strength, seem to negatively associated with the share of equity financing in total liabilities. So composition of a capital flow seems to be related to probability of a financial crisis. And number three, that about the patterns of capital controls. Capital controls tend to rise, or you tend to see more capital controls in countries with weaker institutions. Interestingly, countries that have controls on debt inflow also tend to have controls on equity inflow. So capital controls, when a country has capital controls, you tend to see capital controls on both equity and debt. So I see the slide here. Thank you very much. So this is how can I make it to be a full screen? Oh, you're helping me do that. Great. Oh, sorry. Now the slides on your side. I cannot control the slide. Is that right? Can I? Sorry,
yeah, I'm controlling the slides.
Are you opening your slides? I see. Okay, I see. That wasn't what I was looking for, but it's all right. But can you go? Can we go to the next slide? Now I lost control of the slides. Next one, please. Next one, please. So, so here's a regression representation of the one the fact number one. On this slide, I report the two type of regressions. The first two columns report regressions of change in share of equity financing in total external liabilities on change in quality of public institutions. In columns 3 and 4, I report regression result of level of equity financing in share of total liabilities on level of quality of institutions. So quality of institutions, if you go to the slide before, is measured here by average of a 6. Maybe one more slide before. It's if you look at the last part of the bottom part of the slide, it's an average of a 6 World Bank measure of quality institutions, control of corruption, government effectiveness, political stability in absence of violence and terrorism, rule of law, regulatory equality, and voice and accountabilities. So I'm going to show you pictures and regressions involving average of the 6, but we also do individually. The most important ones for our purpose or in our context are control of corruption and rule of law. Okay, so can you advance back to the previous regression slide, please. So the point is, data suggests a strong association between quality of domestic institutions and composition of capital flows. Better institutions tend to favor more equity financing. Next one, please. For those who may be concerned with the possibility that institutional quality may be endogenous, we can also attempt a instrumental variable approach using the mortality rate of European settlement in 17th, 18th century is a way to do IV. This is something that comes from Ashimogo, Johnson, Robinson AER paper. And that kind of instrumental variable approach tends to confirm the pattern that is using 17th, 18th century variables as IV for today's institutions. So you continue to find the pattern that countries with better institutions tend to attract a greater share of capital inflow in the forms of equity financing, equity meaning FDI plus equity portfolio flows. Next slide, please. Next one, please. So here's a slide about the previous one. Yes, please. About the fact number 2, which is on the relationship between probability of a crisis and composition of capital flows, where we see countries with a higher share of equity financing in total capital inflows tend to have fewer sudden stop crisis or systematic banking crisis. Both are measured taking from the standard measure in that literature. So sudden stop crisis refers to big reversals of capital flows. A systematic banking crisis, there's a count of banking crisis in individual countries, in individual time periods. We see, countries whose external liabilities tend to take the form of equity financing, on balance, experience fewer banking crises and fewer reversals of capital flows, very much related to my review of financial studies paper that I documented early. Next slide, please. This is about the relationship between country quality of institutions and capital control. So EQ, CID, BO, MM, referring to different type of capital flows according to the IMF classifications. The main takeout. So D, the middle part, column 5 and 6 is about the debt financing, bonds, borrowing from international banks. Better country with better institutions tend to have fewer controls of their type on debt flows. That's perhaps not surprising. But I also want to draw your attention to the data pattern that capital flows on equity, portfolio equities, the first 2 columns, on other type of equity financing, CIs, but like mutual fund flows, and also different kind of debt, short-term versus long-term debt. So MM's mutual money market fund flows, essentially short-term debt flows. They all have this pattern that more controls in country with worse institutions, fewer controls in country with better institutions. At high level, this shouldn't be surprising to anyone. We know on balance, rich countries tend not to have capital controls. Poorer countries tend to have more capital controls. So at high level, that's not particularly surprising. But I want to suggest this is not like obvious pattern, because in my early motivational sort of part of the remarks, I mentioned that equity financing in principle provides better sharing of a real side risk. Right? So if it's completely up to capital recipient countries will prefer to receive capital in the form of equity financing because they're sharing properties. By their logic, one might be tempted to think that if a country wants to have the capital controls, they should have control on debt flows. They shouldn't control equity financing. They may want to subsidize equity financing, but that's not what we see in the data. The data suggests that you cannot directly tell from the regression, but the data suggests that in fact, most of the countries with controls on debt financing also have controls on equity financing, and we want to have a story that also provide an understanding or suggest the interpretation of this data pattern. Next slide, please.
Xingqiu, may I ask a couple of
Please.
questions just to clarifying on these two regression, last two? On the one with the probability of reversals, it's of course very difficult to interpret the size of the coefficient, but can you give us a sense of how important the effect is in terms of the changes in the probabilities as opposed to the size of the coefficient itself? So that's number one. Number two, on this one, when you measure capital controls, I didn't see exactly how they were measured, but are they measured in terms of the number of controls, there's some notion of importance, or how strong they are? Do we know that? Do we have data on that, so you can distinguish between just a number versus strength?
Yeah, so it's not so. Starting with the last question, so the capital control measures, if you could go back to the slides when I explain variables. I'm sorry. So once I lose control, I realize I'm going to impose a lot of trouble to people helping me with the slides because I'm going to go back and forth. But so these are essentially the raw data would still be the IMF count, IMF AIE, so annual report on exchange restrictions and exchange controls, have something on the order of 100 or so categories of cross-border capital flow items for which one can have controls. Each category would have a 0 or 1 indication of whether there's a presence or absence of controls. So all of those controls would be adding up those stuff. So they are somewhere between just a pure count of having or not having control, or some intensities, to the extent there's some the intensity is captured by number of subcategories, number of many small subcategories where they have controls on. But it's not the exact same thing as tax rate, for which there's no data. So only for a very specific, narrowly defined set of capital items, such as control on cross-border portfolio flows, for which one may be able to estimate this by looking at differences in returns and so on. Difference in return implies the sum of essentially capital control tax plus risk premiums. But most capital control items, there are no real intensity measures. So therefore, any regression involving actually it's not. Sorry, I'm not going to ask help for the getting to the right slide. But any regression involving capital controls will essentially be this. Essentially, sometimes can be 0, 1. Sometimes can be a sum of presence of control, sum of a number of small categories with capital controls. So that's
okay.
In my mind is somewhere between intensive measure, extensive measure, extensive margin measure. On probability of a crisis is a way to go to the slide on crisis, or should I get back to my control of the slides? Is that be better, or I wasn't sure actually this is supposed to
try and give you control again. So
sorry about this. Yeah, because that will reduce the burden on you to be very attentive every minute. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, and how now? How do I? And how do I see my slide? If I do in the view portion, hide control panel, that doesn't help. would you know how I can make? I don't seems to. Sorry.
You are already showing the
Oh,
initial.
okay. Maybe you can. Can you see? Yeah. Okay. I can see that.
Yes.
Great.
Yes, we can
Thank
see.
you. You can see that. Okay. Perfect. So on crisis probability of crisis. Now, I think I just because these are probability regressions, either
Right.
probability or OS, one can work out the probability, and it's probably stated in the paper. I cannot work out the
Okay,
this
that's all right.
right away. Yeah, but
All
the prop from IFS paper suggests economically it is a big effect.
Okay, thank you.
Now it still seems to have somehow made it work before and then disappeared again. How do I seems to have made it work. Okay, all right. Okay. So there are additional regressions essentially confirming sensitivities, robustness of the result. This works for cross-section data and works for panel data. Now come back to, so these are the three sets of data patterns that we want to understand. That is, composition of capital flows is not random, seems to be related to quality of institutions. Probability of experiencing a crisis, reversal of capital flows, banking crisis seems to be related to composition of capital flows, and then the capital controls seems to be related to quality of institutions as well. So the objective of this project is to work out a simple theory about the determination of the composition of capital flows. In particular, in our baseline model, it will be just about equity financing versus debt financing. But then we're going to have a set of extensions further breaking down equity financing into FDI and non-FDI type of equity financing, and breaking down debt into short-term debt versus long-term debt. There will be later. We'll start with a simple story focusing on just equity versus debt financing, and clearly in our story, quality of domestic institution will play a very important role. One of the additional insight that I learned from doing this project is that improving quality of institutions and relaxing financial constraints or having more financial development are not the same thing. In fact, they are very different in our framework. Well, as existing literature, for those of you who are familiar with the Bianchi Korinek type of a model, often people loosely interpret, think about financial constraint and institutional quality as similar things, but they are actually very different in our story. And we want to also work out optimal capital controls. And in particular, we want to understand under what conditions countries will find it optimal to impose control on both debt and equity. So so one of the result is that once you consider debt and equity simultaneously, there's something that I call spillover to spillover. That is, even though market failure only exists for debt financing, because debt financing faces a collateral constraint, and individual agents borrowing in debt market may not take into account the consequence on aggregate economy. Even though that's the nature and the origin of the market failure, nonetheless, if you don't put constraint on equity financing, there can be a spillover from market failure in the debt market to market failure in equity market, and that's why a social planner would want to put the control on both if market failure exists in the debt market. We want to propose a structure of optimal taxes on debt and equity and study how they respond to changes in institutional quality. And all of those will provide a way to rationalize the 3 data patterns that I suggested early. So here's a summary of the main findings from our model, which essentially will be results consistent with data patterns. So number 1, capital structure is endogenous to a country's institutional quality. Bad institutional quality leads to type of capital structure featuring more equity financing, and in turn, those countries tend to have stronger financial stability, less crisis of various kinds. And then optimal capital controls also depends on institutional quality very naturally. In particular, countries with worse public institutions tend to need to have more capital controls. And whenever it has more capital controls, often it needs to have controls on both equity financing and debt financing. So the last bullet, if you look at the last bullet, says that in our paper we talk about a number of extensions that may also be of interest to the literature and to maybe our central bank colleagues. One is if one decompose equity financing into FDI versus passive equity financing. We'll see our theory will imply that as institutional quality improves, you also tend to see more passive equity financing, or FDI as a share of equity financing tends to decline with quality of institutions. So very rich countries, to the extent they have better institutions on average, have relatively more passive equity financing as well. The second extension is to decompose debt financing into local currency debt versus foreign currency debt, and we'll see that the local currency debt share of fixed income financing also tends to increase with improvement of local institutional quality. And the last interesting extension is to decompose debt financing into long-term debt versus short-term debt, and we'll see the long-term debt share of overall debt financing tends to increase with improvement in quality institutions. I have a feeling that I won't have time to go into those extensions, but I just want to highlight that these extensions are in the paper for people who are interested in checking out those results. So let me go back to now. I'm going to go to a bit of algebra, since this is a attempt to generalize the theory in this literature. So to understand the logic, we want to have a simplest possible model and the smallest possible modification of existing literature, modeling existing literature, to deliver our result. So we start with a structure that's similar to the Mendoza, Bianchi, Korinek, Xiang kind of a model. So it's a 3-period endowment economy, small open economy. Small open economy here means that international interest rate is exogenous to the country. There are 2 goods, tradable good and non-tradable goods. And the representative household preference is defined over these 2 goods in 3 periods. So it turns out for the purpose of explaining the basic logic, we can simplify the model setup drastically. In particular, we're going to assume that the non-tradable good consumption only takes place in the 2nd period. That's a simplification, an important simplification. You can certainly have non-tradable goods consumption in all periods that give you more terms to keep track of with no new insight. So here we just assume non-tradable goods is taking place only in the second period. The tradable goods consumption takes place in all three periods, 1, 2, and 3. The non-tradable goods come as an endowment. So in second period, there will be an endowment for the non-tradable goods appears. The price of the non-tradable goods is going to be endogenous to be solved in the model. And that's in fact is a key variable to be solved in this literature. For the tradable goods, you also have to specify a corresponding endowment stream. The simplest model to keep track of is to assume that there's no tradable good endowment in period 1. There's only tradable income stream in period 2 and 3, so denoted by Y2 and Y3. So these are tradable goods income in period 2 and 3 respectively. You have to have some random shock in the model to have crisis, for the agents to worry about having crisis, for the international lender or provider of capital to worry about crisis and the consequence on the ability for the firm, for the country to repay international investors. So randomness is crucial. The simplest type of randomness one can have is to assume that randomness happens only for period 2 tradable good income. So you can certainly have randomness in every period, but this extra complication will not add new insight. So the simplest way to tell the story, this is following the approach in the existing literature, is to assume Y2, the second period tradable income, is random, and that's the only random variable in the model, and that Y2 follows a uniform distribution from Y lower bar to Y upper bar. So again, just to summarize, in period 1, there's no income. So by construction, the agent has to receive financing from international market, either equity or debt. That's a simplification. So we just force the country to be a net recipient of capital in period 1. And the income stream will be, the tradable and non-tradable income stream in period 2, Y2, Y sub N2, respectively, and income stream in period 3, Y3. Again, the only random variable is Y2. Okay, so that's the structure of the optimization problem, the objective function, I guess, of the agent. To get financing from international market, we allow for both debt contract, standard in the literature, and equity contract, the new element relative to the existing literature on capital flow into emerging markets. In our baseline case, debt is only one period debt denoted in units of tradable goods. This is exactly the same as the existing literature. In extensions, we will consider local currency debt and long-term debt. This will not appear in the next 20 minutes or so. For equity financing, is a contract that allows foreign investors to get a claim on future tradable goods income stream. So if you sell S shares of a claim to foreign investors, foreign investor will get S times Y2 in period 2 and S times Y3 in period 3. Again, in extension, we're going to make this distinction between FDI versus passive equity financing, but not in the baseline model. Financial frictions happens in the debt market following the existing literature, such as in Bianchi and Kolinek. And the financial friction take the form of a economy-wide collateral constraint. So suppose the debt means that contract means that in period 2, the agent has to pay back these upper prime back to international investors. Then the value of a debt in period 1 will be d prime divided by 1 plus r. R is the global interest rate. The maximum amount of debt one can obtain, or the country can obtain, cannot exceed the value of collaterals. And what is the value of a collateral? So on this, I think you can see my slide. You can see my cursor. Okay. So on the right hand side is the value of the collaterals. In the parenthesis, P times YN2 is the value of non-tradable period 2 non-tradable goods, and Y2 is the value of a tradable income in period 2. Suppose the agent has sold S shares of the income stream to foreign investors in period 1, then the remaining share will be 1 minus S times Y2. So therefore, PYN2 plus 1 minus SY2 essentially is the value of the second period income still belong to the developing country, many these are developing countries. But for this value, only 5 fraction of this can be claimed or can be obtained by foreign investors. So we can think of this 5 times the value of the period 2 stream is something that the maximum amount that international investors can feasibly get his hands on. And this amount, 5 times this value, becomes the maximum amount that international investors are willing to lend to the developing country. So this, I'm not spending time explaining this, but this equation itself essentially comes from existing literature, how existing literature model collateral constraint. And this parameter phi is often described as an indicator of financial development. That is, the greater the value of the phi, the more the country is able to borrow from international investors. It's very small value of phi means you are not able to borrow very much because you cannot credibly pledge enough to international investors that will limit amount you can borrow. So in that sense, phi is an indicator of financial development. The P, the price, the unit price of non-tradable goods, is an important variable because P, the way this shows up in this collateral constraint means the more valuable is the non-tradable goods in second period, the more one can borrow in the first period. Yet, a private agent takes this price of non-tradable goods as given. So private agents are too small to consider the general equilibrium effect of his individual borrowing action on economy-wide the price of non-tradable goods. And this is going to be a source of essentially externalities that in equilibrium, the literature suggests that the more individuals borrow in the first period, the lower will be the price of the non-tradable goods in the second period, making the collateral constraint more likely to be binding, and that if the country experiences a negative productivity shock, that can cause borrowing constraint to tighten, that cause the country will be forced to deleverage by selling off its assets, causing a decline in the value of non-tradable goods, which cause a decline in the value of the collaterals, which cause further pressure for deleveraging. So this idea that agents do not take into account the effect of its action on non-tradable goods price, and yet non-tradable goods price can endogenously decline in response to tightening of the constraint, can trigger a vicious cycle. An insight first pointed out by Irving Fisher in domestic economy context, then introduced to open economy literature by Mendoza. Okay, now here's our our enrichment to the model is to just add equity financing to the menu of choices in international financial market. But once you add this, One other thing you want to consider, which we emphasize is not in the existing literature, is the temptation to cheat, to manipulate the payoff. More precisely, it's easy for international investors to give out money, to give money to borrowing country. The difficulty is to get the money back. That's the hard part. So for any international investors, no matter in what form of financing it provides, international investors have to be worried about whether she can get money back in the right amount that the country says she should get back. Therefore, to understand how that consideration matters in equilibrium, we have to understand the incentive and ability to manipulate payoff to international investors from the point of view of the borrowing country's agent. So let's think about the CEO of a firm in emerging markets that might have to decide whether I want to cheat international investors or not. And this can happen both for equity financing and for debt financing. If the true income stream is Y2 and Y3, the CEO have to do the following thought experiment. Suppose the true income stream is Y2 and Y3, but I'm going to steal kappa fraction of that. I'm going to claim that income stream, I'm going to tell international investors the income stream is only 1 minus kappa times Y2 and Y3. What will happen? To do that thought experiments, of course, I will think, if I do that, is a chance that I may be caught, and would I be forced to not only give the money back to international investors, but have to pay an additional penalty to do that, right? So I will cheat if and only if the expected payoff is positive. You do similar thing with debt contract, right? So if international investors give me a debt, I might also have incentive to cheat, similar to if I get money in the form of equity financing. The difference is that in order to cheat on debt financing, I have to forcefully declare a bankruptcy because the payoff function is written differently for debt financing versus the equity financing. So let me say one more time. This is very crucial, right? So to cheat, we have some algebra providing micro foundation for how the incentive to cheat and ability to cheat is different between debt and versus equity financing. But instead of going through the algebra, I'm going to just talk in words. So if an investor provides equity financing to a recipient country, the agent in recipient countries can cheat by either underreporting the revenue for the firm or over-reporting the cost of the firm, because only the profit or a fraction of the profit is what's due to international investors. So the recipient country can misreport revenue or cost, resulting in underreporting profit. For international investors to find out, you have to really have a way to understand, know enough about the revenue and cost in order to know how much you really should get. In comparison, if international investors provide debt financing to the recipient countries, the way to cheat is to declare a bankruptcy. But declare bankruptcy potentially is more costly, involves some debt-weight loss. The literature call it bankruptcy cost, and bankruptcy cost probably is not trivial in most countries. This suggests that the incentive to cheat is very different between the two type of financing, which also means the feasibility to cheat is very different between the two. So in the words of Bent Holmstrand, MIT and Nobel Prize recipient, he called debt financing as information insensitive. Insensitive is an exaggeration, but certain is information less sensitive. That is, from investor point of view, I need to know less about what's going on in the capital recipient firm or country. If I provide debt, I only need to know whether the profit is positive or negative. Whereas equity financing provider needs to understand a lot more about what's going on there, and needs to be able to monitor a lot more about what's going on in the recipient firm or country in order to avoid being cheated. This and the probability of discovering whether someone is cheating you for international investors, and the probability of going to a local court, bring the cheater into court and win the case, depends on the quality of the recipient country's institutions. In particular, if the institution is very, very good, then you don't worry about being cheated, whether you provide equity financing or debt financing. On the other hand, if the institution is not very good, you do worry about being cheated, but you worry comparatively less about debt financing versus the equity financing, because falsely declaring a bankruptcy may be very costly to the capital recipient. So this would imply that in equilibrium, for countries with not so good institutions, international investors will be comparatively more willing to provide debt financing than equity financing. So hopefully that intuition is easier to understand. So I can skip the algebra. So I can summarize. So in a way, in other words, poor institutions or the probability of cheating and being able to get away from cheating concerns international investors. They could cause international investors to want to apply a discount to equity financing if the cheating is much more likely on equity financing than on debt financing. So I'm going to use theta to denote essentially the discount that international institutions, investors will apply to equity financing. The theta in our micro foundation will be linked to essentially the quality of legal institutions in the capital recipient countries. But here, for the subsequent discussion, let's just imagine theta is expected percentage reduction in payoff in equity financing to international investors. And this parameter theta is going to be a key parameter in my subsequent description of the model. Now we're going to take into account both equity. So now I'm going to restate the optimization problem to solve out for the equilibrium. But in this, in my way of describing the equilibrium or optimization model, optimization problem relative to the literature, there are essentially two differences. One is there will be both equity financing and debt financing, and the other is for equity financing, there's a theta discount applied to equity financing. So imagine in period 1, capital recipient countries sells S share of future income stream to international investors, that's equity financing. At the same time, you get some fixed income or debt financing. The debt financing will be D over 1 plus R. So R is the interest rate, D is the payment that the investor will get in the next period. So therefore, in this period, I will only give this neutral investor will give a D over 1 plus R to the local agent. So therefore, the constraints can be expressed in the following 3 equations. One is period 1 consumption, which is only tradable goods consumption, is the equity financing one will get if the recipient country sells as share of the income stream plus the debt financing. So while 1 is actually fair discount value of period 2 and period 3 equity tradable goods stream. Let me see one more time. So suppose while not suppose while 1 is defined is the present discounted value of the tradable goods income stream from the future. If you sell a share of this, international investor will apply theta haircut to that, the maximum you will get from equity financing will be 1 minus theta times S times Y1. Your debt financing will be D over plus R. That's what you get in the first period. In the second period, the agent will consume non-tradable goods. Consumption of non-tradable goods is C sub N2. Value of this will be P times of that. That's value denoted in units of tradable goods. Plus tradable goods consumption. That's the left-hand side. The right-hand side will be the income in the second period. So that's the value of the non-tradable goods endowment. That's the first term. In the second period, tradable goods income, deducting the part due to foreign equity investors, minus the payment to foreign debt holders, amount of D, plus additional 1 period borrowing in second period. So that's the second equation. And the third period, in the third equation, describe, in the third period, agent consumes tradable goods in the amount of C sub T3, plus paying back the debt to foreign investors. The income will be the tradable goods income Y3, subtracting S share due to foreign investors. So this is the three constraints. And the financial constraints, what you have seen before, that has to hold that the net maximum amount one can get in debt financing has to be no greater than the total value of collaterals. Market clearing condition requires that in the second period, total non-tradable goods consumption equals to the endowment of the non-tradable goods. So this describes the constraint in the economy. Agent's problem is to maximize utility subject to these constraints. So I'm going to skip the algebra about how to solve this. But I'm going to simply point out that model like this features externalities in the fixed income, exactly like the literature says. But the interesting thing is that these externalities can spill over from debt financing market to the equity financing market in the following sense. So the way to explain this is to contrast this market equilibrium with social optimal equilibrium solved by a emerging the social planner. So social planner realize the following. I guess I don't have the slide on social planner. So social planner will take the agent, the objective function as given, wants to maximize the same kind of utility the household wants to maximize. The difference is that the social planner realizes that the second period price of non-tradable goods is endogenous, depending on what agents do in the first period. And social planner also knows that market clearing condition has to hold. So social planner will directly plug the market clearing condition into this. And then in that case, social planner would, yes, this is what it says. So we'll realize that the price of non-tradable goods is a positive function of a period two tradable goods consumption. That is, the more agent allow himself to consume more in the second period, the more variable demand for non-tradable goods will go up, and therefore the price of non-tradable goods will go up. And this will make the value of the collaterals to be higher than otherwise the case. This means that the collateral constraint is less likely to be binding for a given negative shock from productivity. Agents do not recognize this. Agents are too small to worry about economy-wide implication of his action, but the social planner knows this, and therefore the social planner solution tends to be different from private sector agent problem. This is essentially the algebraic definition of market failure. That is the market equilibrium deviates from social planners choices. I'm going to skip the algebra and just talk about the results from a model like this. So first, let's consider a special case. Suppose there's no expropriation risk, meaning the capital recipient country has very, very good institutions. In the extreme, theta is 0, so the required haircut or discount on equity financing payoff is 0, so there's no additional discount needed. In that case, capital recipient countries will optimally choose to finance all of the period 1 consumption by equity financing. That is, in this very simplified model, the recipient countries want to obtain financing only in the form of equity financing. And risk-neutral investors will be willing to accommodate that, because risk-neutral investors doesn't really care about providing equity versus debt financing in that case. In the extreme case, the country achieves full insurance, first best, that is the social planner solution and market equilibrium coincide with each other. So that's the extreme case that's useful to keep in mind, that the deviation from this comes entirely from problems associated with quality of institutions. So that's the extreme case. But in general, incentive to cheat exists. Institution is not perfect. Therefore, international investors want to apply a discount to the payoff from equity financing. In that case, the result can be summarized by proposition 3. That is, the equilibrium capital structure will reflect the degree of expropriation risk, theta. In particular, number one is the similar to the extreme case. That is, if institution is sufficiently good, so that means expropriation risk is below some lower threshold, theta bar, even though it's not perfect. But if it's good enough, you still get the first best, which is that the recipient country will issue only equity. In that case, in fact, the recipient country will lend the fixed income to investors in order to issue all the sell all the random income stream to international investors, and you achieve first best. That's one extreme. The other end of the extreme, if the institutional quality is sufficiently poor, so represented by theta greater than a upper threshold, theta upper bar, in that case, the equilibrium features only debt financing. That is, there's no way for recipient countries to convince international investors to provide equity financing. So the only way for the recipient country to receive any financing in period 1 from international investors is to issue debt. In general, in the third case, when institutional quality is between theta lower bar and theta upper bar, equilibrium features a composition, a mixture of debt and equity. And within this range, the share of equity financing tends to rise as institutional gets better. And so the economy-wide, the leverage ratio, debt financing, the share of total liability, tends to reflect the institutional qualities, and there's a chance for collateral constraint to bind, which in the model represents the probability of crisis. So that's the description of the problem. So here's the slide describing the social planners problem. That looks the same as a private sector equilibrium, with the exception that in period 2, the social planner recognizes the endogeneity of the second period, the non-tradable goods price, and it will, therefore describe the non-tradable goods price differently from private agents, and that difference causes all the difference in the results. So I'm going to describe the difference between social planner problem and market equilibrium by the following graph. So in this graph, by the way, you're welcome to interrupt me with questions. You can put questions in the chat box if you want, and our moderator will convey the questions to me. So on this slide, I have 3 lines. So let me describe these slides carefully. So let's first look at the middle line where you can see where my cursor is. This is a line representing different values of theta, different quality of institutions. The lower the value of theta, the better institutions, the less chance of expropriation. So on the left is the best possible institutions, on the right is the worst possible institutions. So that's institutions. You can think about all countries will fall somewhere on this line. Then in the lower part, I describe corresponding to any given value of theta, what will be the equilibrium composition of capital flows. So there are 3 threshold values of theta, dividing all possible scenarios into 4 essentially. In the first region, when theta is less than theta under bar, so that's that means the region with the best institutions, equilibrium capital flow features only debt financing, so perfect risk sharing and first best, no market failure. In the second region, when institutional quality is between theta under bar and theta star, capital flows features a combination of equity financing and debt financing. Okay. In the third region, between theta star and theta upper bar, you also have a combination of equity financing and debt financing. So what's the difference between these 2 regions? Well, we go to the top part. The difference is that for theta below theta star, the social planner solution still is the same as a market solution, meaning social planner decides there's no need to intervene, or there's no way to improve upon the allocations. So that applies to both region 1 and region 2. But for region 3, a social planner decides that the private agent is getting too much financing in first period. Private agents fail to recognize that getting less, consuming less in the first period allows second period value of a collateral to be higher, and therefore we're reducing the chance of a financial crisis. So in region 3, even though you also still have debt equity combination, social planner want to constrain the ability of the agent to get money, equity or financing in the first period. So social planner decides that private sector agents tend to over-consume in first period, and therefore wants to constrain the ability of private agent to consume in the first period, and they will improve the allocation by reducing probability of crisis in subsequent periods. Region 4 is region in which theta is greater than theta upper bar, corresponding to the region with worst set of institutions. The equilibrium capital flow features only debt. That the only way for the developing country to get financing is to issue debt. The haircut required on equity financing is too big for international investors to be willing to provide the equity financing. In that case, still, when country can only borrow in debt, still social planner thinks the country tend to overborrow, or individual agents tend to overborrow, and therefore they will require some social intervention in the form of capital controls. So to summarize, all countries can be classified into 4 different kind of cases based on value of institutions. For each of the case, we can have equilibrium capital flow work out, and we can also work out whether social planner would want to intervene or not in the form of capital controls. So here's a proposition summarizing words and algebra about what I said before. So I'm going to skip this slide. I want to make 2 remarks from this result. One is in our formulation, institutional quality theta and financial development phi shows up in the collateral constraint, play very different roles. So phi is something that you get from the existing literature. Theta is what you get from our story, our new element focusing on institutional qualities. So here are a few differences. So even though improving institution and relaxing financial constraint can both lead to a reduction in probability of a crisis, but they have other predictions. Some are consistent with data, some are not. In particular, so if you relax financial constraint or improving financial development by raising value of theta, in the existing literature, interestingly, this will lead to an increase in debt financing, because when you relax the collateral constraint, international investors will be more willing to extend the debt financing to international investors. In contrast, improving institutional quality by reducing value of theta tends to lead to more equity financing and less debt financing. So better financial development and better institutions have opposite prediction on what will happen to composition of capital flows. That's one difference. The other difference is that, interestingly, relaxing financial constraint in existing models, at least in numerical simulation, leads to more capital controls, not less. In contrast, improvement in institutional quality will lead to less capital controls, not more capital controls. Now, if you think about cross-country patterns, clearly going from country with data suggests going from less well-governed countries to better governed countries, we tend to see reduction in share of debt financing, increase in share of equity financing, and we tend to see a reduction in extent of capital controls. And those patterns seem to suggest that to understand cross-country differences in capital flow patterns, in capital control patterns, differences in quality of institutions seems to be more important than differences in financial development. So I have some numerical example that says what I just said. I'm going to skip that part. Let me pause for a second to see if there are questions or comments on this.
I guess I have one question, and I suspect you've already done work on that, knowing you. The interesting difference between institutional quality and financial development, that suggests that that's an interesting avenue for empirical research to see whether if you can separate countries into those, and you actually do see the kind of effects that your model suggests.
So in the data, at a very high level, financial development and institutional quality tend to be positively correlated. This suggests that in the model, the two will have different prediction for composition of capital flows and capital controls, which means that financial development implication tends to be rejected by the data. Financial development implication from the model like this tends to be rejecting the data, whereas the institutional quality implication of the model tends to be confirmed by the data. I don't know whether that.
But I mean, but they are positively correlated, but I presume there is a little bit of difference. So you can say countries that have relatively more of financial development compared to institutional development should have more one type of capital flows.
Yeah. So holding institutional. So in our model, holding which we probably should check in the data, which we haven't. Holding institutional quality constant, then better financial development tend to lead to more debt financing than otherwise the case, and tends to lead to more capital controls than otherwise the case. Yeah, my suspicion is that this probably does not hold the data, is my guess, but we should check that. Check that formally.
All right.
the other thing, the other potentially interesting insight from this setup is that let me go back to this picture. So in region 3, when composition of capital flows features some debt, some equity, and yet the social planner thinks private sector agents are not doing right the thing and wants to impose capital controls. The optimal control features a tax on debt financing and also a tax on equity financing. And the logic is this: social planner. So even though equity financing, I said, has a better sharing feature, and even though if the country only gets equity financing, you achieve first best. Despite that, social planner wants to tax equity financing as well. And why? Because social planner recognizes that debt financing and equity financing are substitutes, and that the problem with the private sector or decentralized equilibrium is that agents tends to consume too much in first period, making the economy more vulnerable to a crisis in the subsequent period. So social planner wants to restrict total amount of external financing in the first period. Because debt and equity financing are substitutes, just tax debt is not enough because they will induce agent to issue more equity financing. Therefore, optimal policy features a positive tax on both equity and debt. These are two different tax rates. On balance, the model implies a lower tax rate on equity financing than on debt financing. But in the data, unfortunately, because we don't really have a direct measure of the intensive margin, this is related to Hans' early question, we cannot formally test whether the tax on equity financing is lower than tax on debt or not. So someday maybe we'll have better data on this, and there will be an interesting application to test as well. But here I just want to highlight this insight that optimal tax features control on both debt and financing, something that seems to be confirmed by the data. The presence of control on both equity and finance and debt is confirmed in the data, but not explained by the previous literature. I think that's interesting as well. I have some extension about FDI versus equity financing, short-term versus long-term debt, but local currency versus foreign currency. But rather than going through this, maybe let me stop here to see if there are questions, additional questions or quick criticism or not. Let me go to the conclusion slide. So see, but I just stop here to see if there are questions or comments.
Another question, if I may, which is one of your stylized results in the beginning was that equity flows are more stable than debt flows. Is there any way that your model can explain it, or does your model, is it able to think about this relative volatility?
Yes, indeed, because so this comes from the collateral constraint part of the model. The collateral constraint applies to debt financing, but not equity financing. And when a random shock happens in this economy, so in our model economy, it's just productivity shock in the second period. But in general, it can also be falling interest rate shock, falling demand shock. All those shock will create a change in the ability of the country to borrow in subsequent periods. So the debt flow becomes more volatile. Debt flow essentially responds to those shocks, whereas equity financing is much more stable. So equity financing doesn't, because of the risk sharing feature. Therefore the equity financing does not need to respond to those kind of shocks. So the model indeed generate these differences in volatility across different types of capital flows.
Okay.
I want to just note for our central bank colleagues, we are living a period right now in which United States, European Union, and many other advanced countries are seeing acceleration in inflation, and U.S. central bank at least seems to keeps being surprised by how high the inflation is. So compared to each FOMC meeting feature a revision of predicted inflation going upwards. Sometimes the revision can be very big. This suggests to me that now there's a increased risk that U.S. central bank can raise interest rates faster or sooner than what they are currently predicting, and by a greater amount than what they are currently predicting. And history and research tell us this can lead to a lot of changes in global financial system. In particular, we can see reversal of capital flows of capital going into high-income countries. The United States, in particular, we should expect to see many currency crises, many banking crisis, many debt crisis in the next few years that we might prediction. So, one of the takeaway from a research like this says that composition matters, and that there's perhaps a window of time in which, I'm saying, my educated guess is there will be, a window of 6 months or so, hopefully longer, but probably 6 months or so, in which country can do something to adjust. So to the extent policies can be used to build up reserve, policies can be used to influence the composition of capital flows, these will be useful things to do.
Excellent. We have.
This is Mangal.
Mangal.
Hi, Hans. Mangal.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I have a quick question. Wondering if this whole bias towards debt in a situation where your financial market development is greater than the domestic institutional quality is driven partly by the tax deductibility issue rather than anything else, because debt is usually,
it's not universal, but in some countries indeed the tax system offers additional benefits for debt financing. Interest income tends to be deducted from tax liabilities. This will further reinforce the incentive to borrow in debt form. That's indeed the case. That, I think, quantitatively is not the main reason for the pattern we see. To the extent countries all have, most countries, to the extent they offer differential tax treatment, they tend to favor debt, right? So that's there, but we see in the data still debt versus equity ratio very systematically, and there can be a huge dispersion there. So that seems to go beyond just the tax treatment of the debt financing.
Thank you.
Sure.
Just as a curiosity, I don't want to take too much time. I think we're getting towards the end of our allotted time here, but you mentioned local currency versus foreign currency debt. That introduces, of course, monies, which you haven't introduced yet, and nominal exchange rates and all that sort of stuff. Just briefly, what are the issues there related to, exchange rate flexibility, hedging of exchange rate risks, and all that sort of stuff?
Right. So in the extension, when we discuss local versus foreign currency debt, a few things that may be worth highlighting. One is local currency debt also provides risk sharing. So it's something that's preferred. recipient country can get local currency financing, there will be preferred form of financing. But equilibrium debt structure, has to take into account both what lenders want and what the borrowers want. To lend, of course, local currency debt is riskier. But here, international investors, in fact, are risk neutral by construction. So we actually remove that part of features. Not so much about international investors want to attach a risk premium to local currency debt, but instead, the problem with local currency debt for lender is the lender worry that the country here, the central bank in particular, may have a temptation to reduce the value of the debt to foreign investors by strategically altering inflation rate and exchange rate. Essentially means international investors would want to apply a discount to payoff coming from a local currency debt, similar to the equity financing that we see in the baseline model. In other words, here the issue can be thought of as the ability for central bank to commit to a particular inflation path, a particular exchange rate path, may be correlated with local institutional qualities. Then with weaker ability to commit, international investors would want to apply a greater discount to local currency debt. And in equilibrium, that makes it harder for recipient country to issue local currency debt, because local currency debt becomes worth less to country with weaker commitment abilities. So equilibrium debt will feature, for country with weak institutions, tend to feature more dollar debt than local currency debt. For country with stronger commitment abilities, you're going to see more local currency debt. That's how this works out in our estimation.
Right. Great. Thank you. I don't see any other questions, and we have, I think, run out of time, I'm afraid. But so it remains for me, in any case, on behalf of both our institutions, the SEACEN Centre and the ASB, to thank you, Xingqiu, for very, very interesting presentation. And I particularly, it was so intuitive and clear once you do it. The mathematics looked tricky in the background, but it was very, very easy to understand what the structure of the model and as well as the results. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. And
for my part, again, thank you very much from the ASB, and I'll let Ole have the last word.
No, thank you from the SEACEN Centre as well for a very rich paper. I think it's providing us with lots of food for thought, and hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be able to welcome Xingqiu in person in the region. So keep your fingers crossed that the situation improves, and please stay safe, stay healthy, and see you next month for the next installment of the ASBxSEACEN Webinar Series. And thank you, Xingqiu.
Thank you, Ole. Thank you, Hans. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.